Greetings one and all, it is me, Shingima Vima, and I'm back with another video today. This one won't be as long as most of the other ones that I do, I hope. But I'm talking about an awkward diplomatic moment that happened, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. That's when President Donald J. Trump of the US met with President Joseph Boakai of Liberia. Well, he met with several West African presidents, but among them was Joseph Boakai of Liberia, in which Trump remarked, you all seen the video now, how, where he had learned his English because his English was so good. So we'll be talking about that and the ridicule and the condemnation, as well as the defense. You've heard all that already, so we won't get into any of that, or at least not prominently. But today I will be talking more about why this matters, or why it should matter, and sort of focusing on the interactability of Liberian history from American history and American history from Liberian history. So let's cook. On June 9th this year, President Donald J. Trump met with the presidents of 5 West African nations, and these are Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Mauritania, and Liberia. Right. And the meeting largely was themed around these African countries wanting to pivot from being charity cases, in the spirit of sort of Dambiso's dead aid, to say, the tagline was actually from aid to trade, to find ways in which they can develop more mutually beneficial partnerships with the US in this case and other Western nations. So that's what the meeting was about. The awkward interaction, right, has since gone viral, time's over. It's almost been 2 weeks. So I won't rehash that moment here. Y'all have seen this. By now, that awkward interaction is quite literally last week or 2 weeks ago's news, right? At the rate things are happening with either the Trump administration or just in global geopolitics, it is just another cringey footnote in 2025. So why bring it up at all? Well, because the disconnect is quite unnerving. Not because English is the most spoken language in the world and wow, many people don't speak it. It's no surprise when they do, especially if they are a world leader. Anglophone African leaders have razzled and dazzled with their English speeches for decades now.
We have not asked for any inch of Europe or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle.
In the beginning,
Joseph Boakai of Liberia is an Anglophone president. Heck, non-Anglophone African leaders have razzled and dazzled them, right? But it's
because of the ongoing and devastating war, the imperialistic forces have...
Right. But it's very interesting to think, too, of that list of 5 African countries, 3 of them, Mauritania, Senegal, and what's the other one? Gabon are Francophone. Then Guinea-Bissau is Lusophone. So Liberia was really the only English-speaking country there. And this is not because this is the first time a Western leader has made such a gaffe vis-a-vis the continent or other people of the non-Western world. If anything, that's par for the course. No. This was unnerving because Liberia kinda matters to the story of the USA. And the US certainly matters to Liberian history. And that goes right back to the beginning. Well, the beginning of modern Liberia, as it were. See, settlement by freed African American slaves, or formerly enslaved Africans who had been enslaved in the US. That settlement in Liberia began in 1822. And that's pivotal here. I will explain how we get there, but it's very important to understand that, of course, there is indigenous African peoples there already, right? The Loma people are there, of which President Boakai is one of them. George Weah, the previous president and Ballon d'Or winner, is of the Kru people. So the Grebo people are there. So there's different groups, African indigenous groups that are already there. But the people who go back and will end up being the founders of the modern republic, that is Liberia, were freed African American slaves. And we'll talk a little more about that as we proceed here. So, the settlement begins in 1822, and by 1847 it has been established as a republic, making it the oldest republic on the continent. Now, to be clear, in so saying, I'm not assigning any special Eurocentric value to this distinction. After all, life was lifing across the continent. Shaka Zulu, beginning in the 1820s, had recently ascended to the throne in Southern Africa. Muhammad Ali, no, not that one, was knee-deep into his controversial modernization of Egypt under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire. The Ashanti Empire stood tall and mighty against pending British colonization in the 1820s. In the era before the mass colonization of Africa, in the 1880s after Berlin Conference, the modern nation-state was in its infancy. Born of the Enlightenment era and associated revolutions, the French, the American Revolution, etc. Put another way, there is no running away from the Western hegemonic origins of the contemporary nation-state system. And 1822, as the beginning of the settlement, is early. Just how early? Well, it's a couple years before the proper colonization of India, which is a seminal moment in the colonization of Asia and Africa, right? But that happens in 1824. And it's less than 50 years since American independence. If that seems like a non sequitur, follow me here. Well, I'll tie it together, right? If you can imagine, the US in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Slavery is still legal in the US, but there's a growing number of freed black people, either manumitted or born free, right? These freedmen, right, these formerly enslaved African Americans, are carving out lives in northern cities and some southern towns, and they are not slaves. But, society's switch doesn't just flip like that. So they are also not exactly welcome. People who've owned you as slaves or who've known you as slaves, even if they didn't own some themselves, there may be a bit of a gradient to them accepting you, right? If they ever do. So this is enter the American Colonization Society, the ACS as it were called, which was founded in 1816 by a strange alliance of people who had mostly nothing in common except wanting the free black people in the US to not live in America. So a body of white Americans who believed that the increasing number of freed African Americans in the southern states made it harder to keep the other black people around them in slavery. Remember, slavery is still legal. The transfer of slaves, right? The transatlantic slave trade. Now that's out by 1816. It's been banned by then. So it is more incumbent upon that the institution of slavery persist by keeping the people who are enslaved so that the children can, slavery was going to be around for another 40 years or so, 50 years. Some of these people were abolitionists, right, who thought black Americans would never find safety in equality in the US, and it was an opportunity for them to escape racism, start their lives anew, and form their own nation where they could enjoy liberation and citizenship. So it was a benevolent thought. And of course, eventually, as you see, a lot of black people also felt the same way. But that's one. Others were slaveholders, terrified that freed blacks would inspire enslaved people to revolt. And still others were just good old-fashioned racists who didn't want an integrated society and considered the repatriation, the resettlement, the colonization of space, which we're going to talk about shortly, as a means to remove those who might threaten slavery. So what was their solution? We're going to ship them to Africa. We're going to ship them to Africa. And who are these men? Let's talk about a few of them, right? So the organization, American Colonization Society, was initially known as the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color in the U.S. For colonizing the free people of color of the U.S. And among their leadership were the likes of a few people here I'll mention. Bushrod Washington. Bushrod is a wild name. But if you recognize the name Washington, he was nephew of George Washington. And he was actually the first president of the American Colonization Society. And he represented the elite political backing for the project. Somebody else who was a high-ranking member was Francis Scott Key, whose name you may recognize as the writer of the national anthem, who was an ACS supporter, right? He viewed colonization as a benevolent way to handle racial tensions in America. Francis Scott Key, while owning slaves himself, also freed some of them and advocated for colonization as a way to address slavery, though he wasn't an abolitionist or anything like that. Other names you may come across in history who were part of the ACS include the likes of Reverend Robert Finley, Charles Fenton Mercer, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Elias Cadwell, and so forth. As the ACS grew, right, the organization sought to create and settle a colony in West Africa to fulfill its mission. In 1820, the first group of immigrants, numbering around 86 people, set sail for West Africa. Because many of the immigrants fell ill with African fever and the rainy season impacted travel to the coast, this trip was not as successful as supporters hoped. To avoid a repeat of these issues, the ACS and its agents decided to send future groups during a different time of the year. And full disclosure here, allow me to mention some of the sources that I'm using this. There's, I'm not tin hat kind of cat. So a lot of this I've actually gotten from the White House website, right? So this is actually pretty indicting that this is on the White House website. But I've also used, those of you who watch this channel regularly know one of my favorites is Kevin Shillington's History of Africa book. I've used that as well. Then I've also sought some information from the Liberian websites, Liberian government websites. So this is where I'm putting this together. But this part I'm referring to is largely taken from the government sources, indeed, the American government sources. In 1821, the next group of migrants and ACS, so these are freed African Americans, right, and ACS agents traveled to West Africa, right, stopping in Sierra Leone to search a suitable colony to purchase and settle. So they were actually trying to settle in Sierra Leone earlier. They actually approached the British to try and settle in Sierra Leone earlier. Sierra Leone, in many ways, it neighbors Liberia, but it also slightly resembles Liberia in that it is formed, the modern nation of it, by people who, some of the people who had fought on the side of the British during the American Revolution, as well as some other people who were being taken off into enslavement after it had been made illegal. So when those ships were intercepted, some of those people were brought back to Sierra Leone, and it became like a British crown colony. I say that to say, but this happens before Liberia is established, so that's important to say that the model of repatriating formerly enslaved people who you didn't want in your spaces had been set into motion by the British in Sierra Leone, and the Americans initially the American Colonization Society initially considered just joining up with them, but no dice, so they ended up purchasing land under the threat of gunfire, right? So they were coercing the African chiefs in modern day Liberia to give them some land. And I will touch back on that later. It will come back because I think Kevin Shillington talks a little more about that. But in 1847, so 1822 settlement begins. By 1847, they declared the colony the Independent Republic of Liberia in 1847, making it the first republic on the continent, as I explained earlier. The name was derived from the word liber, right? Liber, from where we get liberty. It's Latin for freedom. So to say, the land of the freed African Americans. It had a constitution modeled on that of the U.S., and its capital, Monrovia, is named after James Monroe, who had been the president of the U.S. at the time, 1817 to 1825, the original settlement started. So that's a lot of American shout-outs, right? The Constitution is modeled after that. The name Liberia stems from being free from American slavery, and the capital city is named Monrovia after James Monroe. Integration with the local population was gradually extended, although the original settlers and their descendants dominated political, economic, and intellectual life of the country. We'll talk about that later as well. In fact, from 1847, we don't get our first non-American Liberian, because this class of this lofty class of what became elites or formerly enslaved people who go into the space and end up becoming elites, ends up dominating, or they become known as Americo-Liberian. And we don't get our first non-Americo-Liberian president until 1980 of almost 150 years later. But we'll come back to that. Education expanded, and during the course of the 19th century, Liberia, they produced a number of outstanding African intellectuals. Trade in palm oil, coffee, ivory, camphor became the country's major export. Although from the founding of the ACS going back now, many people across the country supported it and the idea of colonization, including many powerful government officials. President Jefferson was an early supporter of the colonization movement. During his time in the White House, he and Governor James Monroe, right, who would later be president, corresponded about the ideas for moving the free black people of Virginia. President Jefferson even contacted American Minister to Great Britain, Rufus King, which is a natty name, man. That is dope. To inquire about setting up a colony in the British colony of Sierra Leone, which is what I was talking about earlier, which the British had ultimately rejected. James Madison was also a strong supporter of the ACS. He was elected the third president of the organization in 1833 and served until his death in 1836. Like his immediate predecessors, James Monroe was a supporter of the colonization and the ACS. During his tenure as governor, James Monroe played an active role in the movement to punish formerly enslaved black people who supported or actively participated in enslaved uprisings by transporting them outside of Virginia. While not explicitly active in the main chapter of the organization during his presidency, Monroe did use his influence and power in the White House to help the ACS obtain necessary authority to carry out its early voyages. After his presidency ended, Monroe became more open in his support of colonization and the ACS, serving as president of an auxiliary chapter of the ACS, and later, even though he is known as a champion for the emancipation and freedom of black people, President Abraham Lincoln also endorsed colonization earlier in his life and even during his presidency. He believed that black and white people could not coexist after emancipation and supported sending freed black people to Liberia or to Central America. In spite of strong support for the ACS and its mission, the organization and its efforts failed because of the opposition from the free black community and its leaders. Many of the free black community, particularly those in the northern states, felt that they were American citizens by birth and had no interest in leaving their homeland, especially one that they had helped build for free, to live in a place that they do not know or feel connected in any meaningful way. We can say like, yeah, Africa is their homeland, but a lot of these people had not been taken from Liberia. They had been taken from all across the west coast of Africa. So it could have been Angola or Congo or Ghana or maybe Liberia, right? But also it had been generations for some of them that they were now being freed if they had been taken. Remember, slaves were being brought into the US from the 1600s. So by the time we get to the 1800s, some of them have been here for generations and they're just being sent to this land. So a lot of them were opposed to it. As a result, few free black people willingly traveled to the colony of Liberia, and over time, the number of immigrants decreased from 11,420 in 1830 to 7,836 by 1852, and the numbers just declined. But still, that's still a good core number of people to go there and set up shop, especially if they're getting support from the American Colonization Society and other sponsors, which gave them an socio-economic advantage and political advantage over the Loma and the Crew and the other groups that were in Liberia already. But let's talk about some of the black people who were repatriated or who were involved in the Liberian project, because if the way I've been telling the story now suggests that the black people had no agency, some white people got together and came up with this plan for them, and they just went along with it. That's a deficient way of telling the story. So let's quickly hear about what was going on with the other side, and we'll talk about what they went through. So, like I said, to be fair, this wasn't done without black agency. By then, many enslaved and formerly enslaved black people had been dreaming of repatriation as well since they first landed in the New World. Many of them, right? Not all of them, as we've already established, but many of them were. As such, they saw Africa as a chance to build a black nation free from white oppression. Thus, Although originally organized by American whites, educated blacks soon took over the administration of the settlement. These include the likes of Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who was the first president of Liberia, ruled from 1848 to 1856 until the 1870s, who was a formerly enslaved black man from Virginia, who became a merchant, missionary, and diplomat, and really in many ways was the face of Americo-Liberian leadership. Right? Many religious leaders and missionaries viewed it as a divine calling to spread Christianity in Africa. Other people who were involved were intellectuals like Martin Delany, who saw the repatriation as a form of Pan-African self-determination, even though later on he grew critical. Hilary Teague, who is known as the pen behind the nation, who drafted Liberia's Declaration of Independence in 1847 and was also an editor of the Liberian Herald and also advocated settler nationalism. Other prominent figures later on, one of my favorites is Edward Wilmot Blyden, who is often described as the bridge figure, who was born in St. Vincent. Or is it St. Thomas? It's one of the Caribbean islands. And he migrated to Liberia after he couldn't get into school in the US, and he migrated over there. And he is often called the father of Pan-Africanism. If you've watched my Pan-African videos, I've probably mentioned him there as well. He tried to reconcile settler and indigenous cultures and advocated for education and African pride. He's one of these early black pride, black power type people, right? Push for Pan-Africanism. And he even mocked Americo-Liberians for mimicking the white elites in America instead of building an African identity. So these are some of the black people who were prominently involved. But again, many others were coerced and pressured into moving. Some were freed on the condition that they emigrate. Others faced overwhelming racism, violence, or laws restricting their movement, employment, or land ownership in the US. So they just moved for that reason, right? But the point I'm at pains to emphasize here is how closely American history, right? Because this is also a very young America. This is not superpower America yet. And the history of Liberia are so intricately intertwined. So some of the places, what other places do you see the US in Liberia? We already spoke about the name Liberia, the President Monroe, the Constitution, but other things. Liberia's flag is nearly identical to the US flag, red and white stripes with a blue field, but with a single white star. Its coat of arms, the love of liberty brought us here, and even holidays reflect American influence. The constitutional structure, right, is modeled almost directly after the US Constitution, a president, bicameral legislature, and Supreme Court, right? English is the official language. Would you believe it? Right? Which is something that you would, you should just know that. You should just know that. Even though there's a distinctive Liberian dialect, but really, especially the elites, they speak English. That's the official language. It's not even the official language in the US. Right? Educational models, the University of Liberia, founded in 1862, which is where Blyden came to, followed the American college model. Early schools used American textbooks, and many elite Liberians studied in the US or under American-style missions, including some of the more recent presidents, the likes of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and I believe Charles Taylor spent some time in the US as well. I know he did. I don't know if he was in college, but he was definitely here, as we'll talk about. Then other things like architecture, naming convention, right? Like we're talking about Monrovia, Robert Sport, named after the first president, Buchanan, right? And the names, oh my God, the names, right? So right now you have Boakai, that's a Loma name, where he was the previous president. That's also an indigenous name. But for a long time, we were the likes of Tolbert. We spoke about Roberts, but Tolbert for a while, that's who was taken out in a coup and replaced by Samuel Doe, who was, he is native. But after that, you have Charles Taylor, then Ellen Johnson, right? The guy who killed Samuel Doe was Prince Johnson. So these are the names that you find in this place, right? These are the names of Americo-Liberian names, indeed. And even the press and civil society traditions, right? Liberia developed one of Africa's oldest free presses, such as the Liberian Herald, which Blyden would also go on to become the editor of when he got to Liberia. And indeed, the Americo-Liberians have dominated political life in Liberia. In fact, it wasn't until 1980, as I've been talking about, that Liberia got its first president who was an Americo-Liberian, Samuel Canyon Doe. And even that was as a coup, right? That was in the form of a coup. Himself, Doe was Kran. He's from the Kran ethnic group. But even then, that was a coup. He had to take over power. It wasn't until... Hello, guys. At this point in the video, I got a little uncertain about one detail that I was sharing. And it's a very important detail in that accuracy when talking about people is ever paramount. But also, when I say it's not that important, I mean it doesn't fundamentally shift the point of the video. But I just wanted to come here and set the record straight here, because I've been talking about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the president between 2006 and 2018, as being Americo-Liberian herself. And the reason for that, and I'm not the only one who thinks that, a lot of people probably think that way, is that just based on her name and her experiences, and when I read some of them here, you will see how, her experiences in many ways are the typical experience of the Americo-Liberian. So, for example, consider this. Again, she was born in Monrovia to a Gola father and Kru German mother. So, she's not Americo-Liberian. But she did complete her education in the U.S., studying at Madison Business College, the University of Colorado, and Boulder, and Harvard University. Then returned to work in William Tolbert's government. Remember, he was the last Americo-Liberian president before Samuel Canyon Doe took over, right? She worked as a deputy minister of finance between 1971 and 1974. Later, she worked again in the West for the World Bank and in the Caribbean. So again, all these experiences, and even the biography I'm reading here says, understanding that people make that mistake, while not in fact Americo-Liberian in terms of ancestry, because of her parents' upbringing and her education in the West, Sirleaf is considered to be culturally Americo-Liberian, or assumed to be Americo-Liberian, like I just did. Her parents both grew up in Monrovia, a center of Americo-Liberian influence after being born in poor rural areas. Sirleaf does not identify as such. I think it's very important that, one, it's true, we set the record straight, and two, especially if it's something that she's articulated that she doesn't identify as that. So I do apologize for that. Ultimately, I don't think it changes the fundamental point that I was making, that Americo-Liberians have dominated political life and economic life in Liberia. And the first time that we got a non-Americo-Liberian president was in 1980 with Samuel Doe, but even that was a coup. And the first time we get a democratically elected non-Americo-Liberian president is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which is even more impressive because 2006, she's a woman. She's, that's not a thing that happens all the time anyway in the world. The US is still debating, are we ready for a woman president? You know what I'm saying? So these are things that I thought were outstanding. And this little bit has gone on too long, but I just want to come in here and say that before we conclude the video. One, take over power. It wasn't until 2018 that we get our first non-Americo-Liberian president, who, by the way, I met that year. Was it that year or 2019? I'll put a picture of him in this thing. He came to Michigan, and I think Michigan's National Guard has a relationship with Liberia or something like that, and they just needed some cool Africans to go meet him, move around, and I was one of them, which is great. But also George Weah, for some of you who recognize his name as the Liberian president from 2018 till last year, till 2023. Some of you may also recognize him from soccer, because in 1995, playing for AC Milan in Italy, George Weah won the Ballon d'Or, which is the biggest prize, individual prize in soccer, in football. And thus far, he's the only African to have won that title. And it's amazing because Liberia is not especially known for its soccer. I don't think it's ever been to the World Cup. It's barely at the African Cup of Nations. So the fact that the one African who's won it is from Liberia, and he would go on to become the president. And an important one too, as Liberia continued to usher itself away from the civil war years of the 90s. Indeed. But also, here's another American tie-in. His son, Timothy Weah, soccer fans here may recognize the name, who's played for Juventus and other teams like that, is American, and he plays for the American national team. So this is another American tie-in. Speaking of Americo-Liberians, this may also be fun. I mentioned the gentleman named Charles Taylor earlier, who's had a very interesting relationship with the U.S. over the years. In 1983, yeah, he was Charles Taylor, a former procurement officer for Samuel Doe's government, was accused of embezzling nearly $1 million, and he fled to the U.S., but was arrested by U.S. authorities on Doe's request. Now, at this point, Doe in the 80s, right in the Reagan years, was positing himself as being aligned with the U.S. during the Cold War years, being another capitalist. He sucked as a president, but he was aligned to them, so the Americans were more willing to do his bidding. So as a result of that, Charles Taylor, who had been in college in the U.S., was held in the Plymouth County House of Corrections in Massachusetts, awaiting extradition. Then in 1985, he escaped, just walked out of jail. No guards saw him go, no alarms, no security footage. He and 4 other detainees soared through a window and vanished. You know what makes it wild? It took place at a medium security jail, so not some, some white collar nonsense. The Liberian government demanded his return, and he just disappeared. So people talk about this in terms of CIA involvement, since Taylor had connections from his time in Doe's government, and Liberia has this long-standing Cold War significance with the U.S. After that, Charles Taylor fled to Libya, where he was trained by Gaddafi, and made his way through Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast and launched an insurgency in Liberia in 1989. He becomes a principal figure in the overthrow of Kenyan Doe. But he doesn't become president soon after that, but he continues to terrorize Charles Taylor is largely a large part why there was civil war across Liberia throughout the 1990s. And he would go on to win the quote-unquote democratic election. But anyway, eventually the world caught up with him, and in 2012 he was convicted by a special court for Sierra Leone because he had also caused trouble over there. Spurred the civil war in the neighboring nation as well, and was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and is spending that time in the UK, where he's still serving time today. So yeah, all that. The US president should know that Liberia speaks English, right? Why Boakai himself is Loma, George Weah is Crew. Liberia's history is so intertwined that even if the American leadership doesn't know this, right, a quick briefing should mention some of these things real quick. And I hope you found this video interesting. These are I hope I made it more educational than just critical of a man or of an interaction, of a situation, but just to make it more educational, learn some cool things about Liberia, and we can hope that that relationship continues to be recognized and celebrated where it needs to be, and just remembered for the darker parts of it as necessary. Indeed. Thank you very much for joining me today.